Today I have Dr. A. Srivathsan with us on AudioGAN. He's an architectural scholar with more than 25 years of experience in teaching, architectural and development research, and professional practices. Before joining his role as Executive Director of CAU, Srivathsan served as an academic director of CEPT University for 5 years. He holds a PhD from Indian Institute of Technology along with master's degree in urban design, School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. Today, we are here to document how our contemporary spaces designed, mainly the Hindu temples. So, thank you, sir, for giving your time, and it's a real honor to have you on the show.
Thank you, Kedar. Thank you for inviting. It's my pleasure.
So, before we begin, I also want to thank Ruturaj Parekh from Matter for making this episode happen. So, yeah, just a shout out to him. So, as I mentioned, the entire documentation I wanted to do around designing temples, and I've come up with few questions. So, I'll
Sure.
start off by asking you. So, like, it's a longish question, but like, what is the different about designing a sacred space? I mean, are sacred places of worship built, or they grow organically? And should such spaces be designed also, or just they naturally evolve? We can start there and then open up more questions as we go along.
Sure. So let me first take the first part of your question, which is there anything different about designing a sacred space?
Hmm.
At one level, you can say there is no difference in designing one building from the other because they're all meant to serve the intent and purpose. And all parameters of design and making a building applies to a religious or a sacred building. But that's in a very broad sense, an answer, and that answer may not fully help us. It is not as designing a house or an office, because a sacred building has specific demands on architecture. These demands are not only functional, such as making space for gathering, singing bhajans, ritual performance, and so on. Temple makes specific demands in terms of evocative quality, aesthetic experience, and affordance. Yeah, affordance means what I mean by affordance are clues in the building that guides and directs behavior of the users.
Hmm.
Second, temple is not a new thing in the sense it has a long history, and people have a certain expectation of how a temple must be. So, in that sense, contemporary temples have to engage with questions of history and memory. So there is something very specific about designing sacred space. Now, the second part of the question, which is are sacred spaces or places of worship built? Should they be built or should they grow organically? Should they be designed at all? Again, in the Hindu temple tradition or in the Hindu faith, there are different kinds of temples. The most sacred of all temples, or most sacred of all places, are places which are called Swayambhus, something
Correct.
which manifest on God's own will.
Hmm.
Okay, so no person or a divine or a sage or someone has built it. On God's own
Hmm.
will, some kshetras or some places have emerged, and they are considered far more sacred than others. There are few in number, but most other temples are basically built. Even in Swayambhu Kshetras, it's only the Murti, the deity, the icon, is has emerged on its own will or on God's own will. But the structure per se has to be built. Okay, so any space which is meant to house a deity, either on deity's own will, as the people of faith believe, or out of devotion and will of any patron or group, has to be necessarily built. Whether it is to be built by an architect, either a traditional one or a contemporary one, whether a community can build it in their own way. There are very many ways of building temples, and at the bottom line is all places built with devotion and the purpose of worship are considered sacred.
Hmm. 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 Interesting. So, I'm just curious to understand that although it was designed by a social architect, Sankaracharya, these there are these series of temples which are in the same longitude, I believe. So, is there any significance with respect to the place itself? I understand the Swayambhu part of it, but are there any other dimensions while picking up a place when it's man-made?
The people of faith and those history tells us that some places are considered far more sacred, and it could be for various purposes and reasons. For
Hmm.
example, when the river turns up north and flows, that's where most of the Kumbh sites are, and that's considered sacred because you normally don't see it. So it's going up north heaven and things like that. Or in a place like Srirangam in south, which is an island formed by two rivers or a branch of one main river, and the main river itself
Hmm.
suddenly produces an imagery of the celestial abode of Vishnu surrounded by water. So people read something significant about it. So there are various sites where people read or think or believe as special significance. Now, this is a very interesting conversation
Hmm.
whether the place itself possesses those special significance or people are reading those sort of significance. Okay,
Hmm.
so that is a fundamental sort of a conversation. Some believe people read, some believe actually the site speaks. It's a matter of faith.
Correct, correct. Yeah. And then these are these sacred spaces like public spaces? Because typically when there is like gathering, when there is
Mm.
people coming in, so how or are they different, or how, like, if there's a degree of difference, so what degree is it?
See, theoretically, all temples are public spaces
Hmm.
as places of public gathering, and it's open to everyone to come and worship. But the reality on the ground, they are not public spaces. See, for
Oh.
example, historically, we know the Trivandrum temple was among the first to throw open temples for various castes, and that only in 1936. In Vaikom, another place in Kerala, it was a struggle to get the streets around the temple open for people. We know Gandhi accepted to inaugurate the Birla Mandir in Delhi in 1939 on a condition that it will be open to everyone, including Dalits for worship. Okay,
Correct.
so there are still temples even now which deny entry to Dalits or women. In some cases, non-Hindus cannot enter or maybe go beyond a point. So, in that sense, temples are not truly sarvajanic as we expect it to be, or they should be, in my opinion.
Hmm.
Uh, they are places of worship open to people, but some of them have restrictions.
Hmm.
That's it.
And sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, there's another point. How we
Uh,
can also discuss this from a legal perspective, whether it's
Correct.
a private property or a public property. Okay.
Correct. And just
So
before that, one quick question, like, to make these spaces prohibited for certain type of people or certain castes or sects of people, what sort of provisions were done? And these were, I'm like, obviously it's man-made, but they were like roads only which were blocked, or the entrances were blocked, or within the architecture itself there was some changes done.
not really. The architecture itself didn't have blocks. Basically these prohibitions are very social prohibitions, so which are far more powerful. The upper
Hmm.
caste having complete control on lower caste, or men having far more control on women, uh, is the most effective of restriction. Architecturally speaking, there were no devices, so to speak.
Hmm.
So it was after a long struggle, people gained access. In some temples, for example, in very large temples in Sri Rangam, we know for some time people could not even enter the fifth enclosure. Then they entered and they could go only up to the third enclosure, and further they couldn't go. So it's a period of it's over a long period of struggle. People have gained access to temples.
Mm-hmm. No, and the reason why I was asking this because you mentioned about Gandhi opening up or making a rule or making a like a condition to do that. So it was mainly from a entry standpoint, right? But
Correct.
he couldn't really control the power and the social dynamics of it.
Absolutely not. He
Yeah,
couldn't.
yeah.
And and for very long time, that was in 1930s, but still the struggle continues. For instance, one of the major struggles in contemporary temples in Tamil Nadu has been whether the Dalits could become priests or not.
Mm-hmm.
So the state government, DMK in particular, have been trying to get the Dalits to become priests. That's not fully yet realized.
Yeah. So what is the relation between sacredness and architecture?
Okay. See, there are two major views on this. Okay. And let me first explain that not necessarily from architecture, but from understanding of what sacred is or how sacred manifests. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, there is a group of thinkers, scholars, practitioners, believers think that sacred is already present in this universe, in this world. Okay, it's there. It's there. It's given. Okay, so
Hmm.
it's present. All you need to do is just find that. Okay, find that or somehow manifest it through a certain kind of forms and procedures. This
Yeah.
is one group. Okay, so there is nothing you can do about it. It's there. All your journey is all about discovering it.
Yeah. Uncover the clouds of ignorance,
Yeah.
to put it in a Vedantic sense. Yeah.
So then there is another group who thinks sacred is something that we construct culturally. We hold what is important and sacred to us. And these notions and the method in which we access sacred experience uh, changes with times. Okay, so there was a time when we believed rituals provided that. For another time, we believed bhakti or devotion provided that. So they don't think that the notion of sacred is fixed and it is there, and all we have to do is somehow uh, figure this out. So these groups view architecture differently, the role of architecture differently. For those who believe sacred is given already present, the sacred experience can only be accessed through quote unquote right forms, okay, that already are present. They believe sacred will and can manifest only through suitable or appropriate architectural forms, either as we have already seen them or as it is prescribed in the text. To them, the knowledge as to how to build comes first and the experience later. And most people who believe this most often will only prefer what is broadly called the traditional architecture, traditional temple architecture. To them, that's the most suitable form.
Hmm.
To the other temple, to other group rather, who think sacred or God's karunya, benevolence, or saulabhya as the Vaishnavites would call it, which is essentially in God's great love for humanity. The sacred experience is accessible in any form that is either possible, desirable, or affordable. So for group who take that viewpoint, many forms can bring in that sacred experience. And if you read the great stories of the Bhakti tradition, you have Kusela on one end, and you have a Tamil Saivat saint called Pusala, who competed with the local king in constructing temple. The only difference was Pusala built the entire temple in his heart, while the king was building, the Pallava king was building a grand temple, and eventually the god chose to reside in Pusala's temple. So there is a long tradition which believes that sacred experience is accessible in any which form. There is no perfect. So this is from two groups which look at sacred. But within architecture, broadly speaking, not necessarily only with architecture, generally, there are two views again. Okay, particularly if you see the contemporary perspective. One group of architects think that architecture has no autonomy. It's always subservient to social and cultural conditions.
Hmm.
And they believe it plays only an instrumental role. So such architects will create sacred temples based on what the society and culture thinks architecture play, what role it can play.
Hmm.
While other group thinks architecture is not a mere instrument, it has its own abilities that can mediate sacred experience. Okay, it has an iconicity, it can produce an iconicity, it has an ability through decor, ornamentation, or interior to orient and show the users, in this case, worshippers or devotees, what that sacred is. They also believe that the materials that we use in building such structures can create sensuous experience, which cannot be ignored rather.
Hmm.
So they strongly believe that architecture plays a far more influential role in creating sacred spaces.
Okay, interesting. And then out of which these schools sort of, because I've seen like most of the temples in the south or any part of the country as well are
Mm,
typically in a remote
mm,
location where
mm,
people have to actually travel, not
mm,
the commercial ones, but more where there is Navas kind of a thing and stuff like that.
mm.
So, like both these schools think of those on the same lines, or is there any pattern there?
You mean to say in terms of
The location itself, like far away from the regular society or regular people where they're staying.
not really, but certain, if you believe that there is only a particular way of doing temples, etc., then possibly the choice of the place also has to follow certain prescriptions. While if you take a little liberal view about it, you can always believe that any place can be made sacred. You really don't have to look for something very specific about it.
Hmm. So, does specific kind of architecture forms and style have like a sacred quality, which you briefly
Uh,
mentioned about the material itself being sacred? But are there any other things to that?
yeah. See, there's a group of people who build temples and use temples, believe strongly that certain forms possess sacred quality. Okay, so for example, the Vimana, the Shikara, has to be in a certain way. The Garbhagriha, the Sanctum Sanctorum, the innermost sanctum, should be in a certain shape and form. So this is something they very strongly believe. So here we can bring in the role of Vastu Shastra also.
Hmm.
So a group of people who believe that a sacred form, there is a particular sacred form, there is a particular sacred shape, and there is a particular way in which you need to put them together. You can't just randomly put shapes in any dimension you can't use. In fact, actually, whether it's a temple or a house, it all begins with dimension. In fact, in
Hmm.
South India, before you either you design a house or a temple, you'll have to see 10 matches between the dimension you're using and the star of the patron. So it's a very complex calculation and they arrive at a sacred dimension. So people believe that unless you follow these prescriptions as it's given in the text, you may not be able to possibly build a temple.
Hmm.
So a group of people who think that's how you should build. But there are a few others who really either don't entirely accept it or probably only build the sanctum in a particular way, and the other spaces can be built in different ways. So there's a whole range of responses. But in terms of materials, there is a very interesting history. You see, the most preferred, according to traditional texts and agamas and all that, is not stone as we now think as the best, most
Oh.
durable, sought after, and even expensive material. But the most preferred material is wood, then followed by stucco, brick, and stucco, and stone comes later. In fact, some archaeologists think stone was actually a taboo because it was mostly, at least I'm more familiar with the South Indian history. So Stone was associated with the funerary rites, and for long it was not used. But much later, post 6th, 7th century, stone became a preferred material. Same goes with the deities, murtis also. So the material have changed, and currently, for various reasons, concrete is the most common material in construction.
Hmm. Hmm. And this pattern of wood being predominantly used and bricks and then stone, was it pan India or is it select to a particular geography where wood is abundant or where stones are more, those kind of things?
At least in South India, this was the most preferred.
Hmm.
But some of the Agamic text origin is all in North, in Kashmir and others. So I guess it would have had a wide prevalence. But certainly contingency is also important. But stones doesn't necessarily mean one granite stone. So you could probably use
Hmm.
limestones and so on.
Yeah. Actually, looking at the crowd there, I think stone makes more sense. Yeah. And so what, like you mentioned about Vastu Shastra also, if you can tell like what role does it play? I was particularly interested about with the dome kind of a structure with the conical shapes which are peculiar to temples. Is there something which like you have any insights there?
Uh, See, lots of work has been done on the traditional temples. Plenty of work has happened. In fact, temple architectural history has been the most fascinating and most written history here. So a lot of people have done some excellent stuff work here. So what it appears is the architecture of the Shikara or Vimana, as it's called in South, or the Gopura, the entrance gateway in the entrance, have evolved over a period of time. There are different theories as to where it originated from. Some say it's coming from some funerary structure. Some say it's coming from hut and what. Whatever it is, architects have been consistently over centuries, or maybe even thousands of years, have constantly innovated on the temple designs. Okay, so if you look at the 6th century temple, it's not the same as the 10th, 11th. If you look at the Tanjore big temple, it's phenomenally huge and fantastic. Vimana is very different than when you come probably much later in 16th or 17th century. So there's been a constant innovation of it. But in principle, what they are very simple architectural compositions. You have a cube at the bottom, and you have a pyramid on top with a armlar, a dome on top, and a finial at the topmost point, all pointing upwards.
Hmm.
This is the basic composition, which is vertical. Horizontally, it is a series of concentric rectangles or squares, which progresses outwards and all aligned in the direction. So as somebody who walks in, uh, progressively feels he or she is entering closer to something very important and divine. So that axiality more or less. So these are unchanging principles broadly. But in contemporary temples, things there have been some attempts to look at different possibilities because substantially in recent times, temples have become spaces for larger gatherings. So there is a few shifts in the way spatial patterns.
Hmm. Hmm. So I was going to come to this question later, but then most of the temples have this ornamental look. So we'll come to the contemporary and what role does architects play in the current time. But
Mm,
just to conclude that part, like most of the temples have this like ornamental look.
yeah.
So like does if there are any insights why it was there, and then do you see that pattern in the modern age or the contemporary temples as well?
Yeah. See, ornament is not to be viewed as we now view it as some extra thing, some excess. Okay, it's something that it's just embellished after building. So you can remove it if you don't think you need it. No, ornaments traditionally is very much part of completion. Without that completion, Without the ornament, a building will not be complete. So it plays multiple roles. At a very simple role, it helps you tell a story. It's part of the narrative. It's a place where you can sort of decorate and so on. But another level, these are not only symbols of prosperity and all that, but it is that itself. For example, even in a residence, in a traditional residence, if you go at the entrance, you would find some elements which to a ignorant eye will look like ornamentation, but basically those are the ones which produces a sense of well-being into that house. So they are not a superfluous element. So in traditional temples, ornaments don't are not just to be viewed as superfluous. So they have multiple roles. But in contemporary temples, they don't play such a big role for various reasons.
Hmm. And what are those reasons?
For example, generally there is a modern sensibility. You see, if you look at some of the recent temples, in order to be generally modern contemporary architects are not trained well, or they don't take to ornaments very well. They're partly also ignorant, so they're also not well trained, and their modern sensibility doesn't allow look at figurative arts. So they would not mind using historic forms, but figurative art they're very uncomfortable with. So that's one reason. The second reason is, which is also the notion of superfluous comes from economics. So it's very expensive. You can't these days. I mean, you really have to spend a lot of money and artisans to be used and so on. So they settle for simple geometrical patterns and they don't go for figures. The
Hmm.
third reason is also a certain sense of aesthetics, which is tied to the first. But some, for example, if you look at Pallava 7th century temples, they are not as ornamental in a sense as probably 14th, 15th century temples. So the sense of how to what ornaments to use, how to ornament, etc., also changes. So there could be aesthetical reasons as well from both sides, either the architect or the patron or the community.
Hmm. In the modern age, is there influence of Western architecture in the Indian temples? And the reason why I'm asking is because you said like the new age may not be as uh, I'm now like scared to say ornamental, but yeah, you know what I mean, right? The decorative way of expressing certain or telling stories. Is it because of the Western influence? Is there any angle like that?
I, first of all, I will be a little careful in talking about the corrupt influence of West and so on. Okay. See,
Hmm.
first of all, architecture has been evolving and changing as places, people encounter changes. Um, so modern architecture is not just about West, but it's also change in technology, arrival of new materials, finding out innovative ways of constructing. And there is also today you can't have a sprawling temple. Can be, for instance, you have to build a temple often in the middle of a neighborhood, which is a very smaller plot compared to the old sprawling temples. And then you need to have a kitchen, you need to have a dining hall, you need to have a gathering space. So there is a certain realistic concerns on how temples are built. So so the new architecture, or rather, let's not use the new, but contemporary architecture, has to respond to multiple demands or different sets of demands as it was done before. So, and you would see that not just temples, you just take our own houses. The manner in which our own houses have changed, places of work has changed. We don't see that our houses as a best corrupt form of our existence. No, we embrace change because we are that. So temples are no different because temple is very much a part of our existence, a cultural existence. And it's also very much part of our economic and technological existence. So naturally, how we build temples will change. It's not necessarily to do the Western stuff. Yeah. That's not a productive route to take. But if you primarily see architecture as a product or an outcome of the social and economic conditions, of course, in this case, technological conditions. So temples cannot be an exemption.
In the modern day, like what role does architect play in designing or building temples? Because if the Stapatis or the Sompuras or these stupas also, I believe, are like traditional architects, are like, I mean, what sort of expertise do they bring? And do you need like a modern architect?
See, in my personal experience, I've designed a couple of temples, and two of them have been built. Of course, I didn't stay through the project. But right from the beginning, in my case, I wanted to work with the Stapatis because certain forms of knowledge are not accessible to me. In both cases, my clients were ISKCON. So ISKCON, as you would know, is a sort of a liberal version of the tradition. Okay, so there is no caste and there is no race, etc. But they also follow strong devotional tradition. So the temple also is a combination of that, some traditional elements and some contemporary elements. So how do you access traditional forms of knowledge? As a contemporary architect, I have no clue about it. I've not been trained. Whatever I've learned it through my own personal research, etc., and my own interest that I've learned. So for me, when I have to build a temple and where we have decided to combine both aspects, the traditional and the contemporary, the access to the traditional knowledge is only possible through Stapati. For example, how do you fix a sacred dimension? I have no idea. So I need to work with Stapati. Okay, then I need to introduce certain, I won't say ornament, but I need to infuse my design with symbols that represent well-being within the folds of faith, then again I am not equipped to know that. What I am equipped to do and what I bring to the table is here uh, is now it's like a design problem to solve. I have a fixed site. I have multiple demands. For example, this was just about 3 grounds or something, 4 grounds of site. Then you need to have a dining hall, you need to have a large kitchen, then you need to have some space to sell books, and you need to have a large gathering space. So you bring in your expertise as you would probably solve a spatial problem, and you organize spaces in a more contemporary fashion. And two, as a contemporary architect, I can set the directions for structural expression and so on. And in my case, since I had some familiarity with the tradition as well, so I could think about ways of combining that. But there are certain things which only a traditional architect can do, either a Stapati or a Sompra. This is where we have both of us working, contemporary architect and Stapatis. There are a few places where there are no Stapatis, or there are places where there are no architects either. So it depends on the project.
Yeah, I remember I had done an audio gan with Uday Atwankar, and he
Mhm,
said in the professor from IDC, and he
mhm,
was saying that in like certain slum areas of Bombay,
mhm,
the entire house is supposed to be. I mean, like the biggest concern while they engaged in that activity of redevelopment and like redesigning those spaces
mhm,
was more mostly to understand can I fix hygiene, can I
mhm,
fix the water supply and stuff like that.
mhm,
But when they did user research, I think the demands were that my house should be pivoted or centered from like the main point is TV, right?
mhm,
Because it was quite funny because the within that community, like having owning a TV was like more of a status symbol. So they had
mhm,
like one TV and then like 4 5 families used to watch together. So TV was the anchor point, and then the house was
mhm,
revolving around it.
Mhm.
So in this case, has there been always, or is there any pattern which is emerged that
Mhm.
I understand with the Swayambhu because
Mhm.
it's now fixed, but
Mhm.
where the deity is supposed to be placed, and then
Mhm.
what kind of space? Any insight there?
Uh, see, see, in Swayambhus, as you said rightly, the deity has emerged and around which you build a temple. Okay, so the orientation is determined and the sizes to a significant extent could be influenced, etc. But in other temples, Vastu has a very detailed prescription. Sometimes, in fact, the texts are not complete. Actually, you have to work with the Stapatis because many of the knowledges are in practice, not often in text. Actually, if you see,
Hmm.
through practice, this knowledge has been shared. So they have a way in which how to fix the position of this sanctum, how to give a certain tilt in the orientation. So there's a whole set of ideas in practice. Now, in contemporary buildings, again, some architects do follow some of these practices, or it is purely determined based on the spatial layout and what you really want to do. Uh, but as you gave in the case of the TV example, not all our decisions are purely based on some economics or something. There's a whole range of mm, aspects that influence our decisions, and temples are no different. Sometimes a temple is built by two communities which are fighting. See, as I've seen in US in some of the temples, which was part of my research in my postdoctoral work. So you have multiple groups coming and building a temple, and each group has a shrine for each one of them. So there is a constant negotiation as to where to place which deity and all that. So the temple also is an outcome of negotiations.
Wow, brilliant. And sorry, I'm asking a bit silly question, but when there is these, if you go to Kedarnath or if you go to these Swami Narayan Mandir and other places, there are these barricades which are put just for taking darshan in a orderly way. Although it's not followed, but it's there.
Hmm.
Now, do modern architects consider that as one of the constraints while designing a space?
Absolutely, absolutely. Queuing today is arranging queues, managing queue systems are absolutely necessary if you're designing large temples or temples which you think. For example, I had designed a temple in Tirupati at the bottom, not at the top for ISKCON. Okay, so they have 2, 3 days in a year which you have a peak flow. So you need to anticipate how you would manage the queues, and absolutely very essential, particularly in those festival times. And you will also see, for example, we looked at the new design, isn't it, for Kashi temple recently that was announced. So there's a lot of discussion in the design of how to manage darshan and how to regulate people. These days, issue of security has come in, and after this pandemic, even how to regulate distance will also be part of it.
Hmm. It's quite interesting to look at that aspect as well.
Mm,
So, if you can give, like, I mean, this is like a second last question which I have, is
yeah.
that like, then what are, if you can take any example of how these, all this learnings or all these interesting insights were have culminated into like a new modern age temple. You can like take any example, or maybe you can, if you have any idea about the Ram Mandir which is being built.
Yeah, see, yeah. I have see one of the recent books that I co-edited with my friends
Hmm.
on contemporary temples, published by Marg last year. So I have an essay there where I've looked at least about 8 to 9 temples built in recent times. Okay,
Hmm.
and each architect has adopted different strategies because their concerns, their clientele, or their community in which they're operating has changed. For instance, if you take Samip Padora's design for Shiv temple in Vadeshwar,
Yeah.
you would find that it's basically a shikara and the Garbhagriha fused into one monolith structure without any ornamentation. And it has a very contemporary looking porch or entrance at the front. And unlike a traditional temple where the top is more or less closed, he sort of opens it out for sunlight to come in. But of course, it's a very small temple, but it looks quite appealing because it sits beautifully in a landscape. And I'm told, and I saw pictures that local citizens have also embraced it. But in a very contrasting manner, one of his new temples in Andhra somewhere, I forget the location, which he has designed, is very different. So what he has done is he's taken a traditional South Indian temple and built it into a series of steps going into the landscape. People can sort of sit and use that. So this is absolutely a different strategies. The another interesting temple that I have seen is again closer to Hyderabad in a place called Venachat, designed by a very young architect by name Sai Krishna. So he has taken long size bricks and turned it around to do a very abstract shikara, which is beautiful. The colors are lovely. And what he has done, it's a very interesting an important design move, I think, is because see normally when you design a temple, the boundary wall has to be solid and big because how you separate the sacred space from the not so sacred space. Okay, so within the boundary is the sacred space.
Hmm.
So what he has done here is he has perforated that boundary. Normally you don't do that. He has perforated that boundary and looks like a jali, so you could see the temple inside, and as well as you could see a lovely huge tree outside where the village people gather. So he's establishing the temple as some kind of an extended social space as much as it is a religious space. I think it's a very interesting and a very important innovation because now you're redefining the temple's role architecturally. So I find a series of such very interesting changes that are occurring. Not many contemporary architects do these projects, but I'm sure hopefully in days to come you'll see far more examples.
Sure, sure. And you have any insights about the Ram Mandir?
Okay, the Ram Mandir is entirely a very unique, specific problem. See,
Hmm.
because here, in one sense, to me, the architecture is a bit disappointing. I saw the
Mhm.
pictures and models, and I've read
Hmm.
a few articles on it. One, because even as a temple design, see, it is struggling with the idea to make some sense with the new role of this temple as a national temple. It's no more just an Ram temple in Ayodhya. So you would see styles of various regions fused there. You'll have the South Indian in the first row, and then you'll have the Eastern architecture, and then the final one is more North Indian. So it's a kind of a mix of different styles, and there is a compulsion there because there the agenda of the temple design is to one constitute the larger national uh, group of Hindus, so it's appealing to different regions. Two, its problem is it has to look as old as it could because it's on that grounds the temple has emerged. So they really not done much there. I mean, I haven't. I mean, I would love to go and see after it's completed. So what I'm saying is that since it has two compulsions, one to constitute an appeal to a larger national level, imagined or organized into group, it tries to fuse all kinds of architectural style. So see that. Okay.
And
Two, I'm just saying is that it cannot appear anywhere new in any sense of the word. because it's all built on the premise that it's a very ancient site. So one of its main agenda is to look as old as it could. So they would be very even happy if it gets a sort of a old look quickly. So in that sense, there's nothing new or inspiring in that. Second, it's a problematic site. You cannot always or erase the existence of all this contestation and fight. So it's going to be, it's a difficult site. It's a difficult
Hmm.
site, and I'm not so impressed with the design.
Correct. And also there's like a strong political part of it that everything has to be sort of optics
Absolutely,
driven and
absolutely.
output driven than
Yeah,
the actual content.
yeah, it's a more a political project than a religious project. It's not.
Yeah.
It appears a religious structure, but it's a political statement, and so. So it's not really, even if you were to evaluate, if you were to ignore the politics, which is very difficult, if you were to, and if you were to look at it as there's, I
Hmm.
think, much better could be done.
Hmm. Cool. I think I'll end by asking you like how do you envision sacred spaces or temples of the future?
I think it will be as varied as different user groups and communities that we will have, and we'll continue to have. Because what we are increasingly witnessing, despite whatever the political agenda is to homogenize temple users and temple worshippers, which I personally I disagree and I oppose. Because one of the significant aspect of Indian culture of worship and all that is the variety in which people engage with the idea of religion and sacredness. And the different kinds of temples and sacred structures that we see is a witness to it. So, uh, so I don't think it will be possible to homogenize, and there could be one or two examples, maybe like Brahma, which tries to do that, which it eventually on the ground it will not necessarily happen. Okay? So you would have variety, and I desire those varieties because the variety is the indication of different ways in which people engage with ideas of faith and worship. Okay,
Hmm.
so you will find some going back to very traditional ways of doing things because that's the group they represent, and probably that's what they think sacred is. But what excites me and what I desire to look personally, because not only just because I'm a contemporary architect, but I'm also an historian in a sense that I've seen over thousands of years temple designs have changed, evolved, and always figured out how to represent sacredness, how to make it far more accessible to people, how to make it more inclusive, all people, no caste, no gender discrimination. So, what will be the new kind of architecture that will state this? Because, in my opinion, traditional architecture cannot do that because it is embedded in certain notions about caste and gender. So, we need to find a different language, both from social perspective, but also as a design solution uh, to meet not only different demands that are made in temple, but also ways in which we can make such sacred experience accessible. And I strongly believe that the designers they have the capability and will find different ways of doing it. So I look forward to a future where there are many varieties of temples, and in particular, I look at how contemporary architects are far more sensitively, creatively, and sort of culturally, politically sensitively designing temples.
Great, great, great. And for a person like me, who's half in faith and half in modernity, I think with so many gods and goddesses, we are bound to like reach diversity itself. So it won't
Yes.
be homogeneous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I think this is a good note to end. Thanks a lot, sir, for giving your time, and it was
Oh,
really wonderful talking to you. And yeah, got to learn a lot, document some good stuff with respect to temple architecture. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kedar. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for having me in your podcast.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. Catch us on iTunes, Savan, Stitcher, or any podcasting app you use. Do rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Stay tuned for more Gyan on audiogyan.com. Till then, bye.